Hi, and welcome to this lecture on biological sciences. So as always, here are the learning objectives. Now there's a fair few here, but don't worry, pause, work on them, work together to make sure that you can answer each and every one of these questions for the exam. Okay? Now, these learning objectives have fallen out of these content descriptions from the latest version of the Australian curriculum, version 9.0. Okay? So what we have here are the content descriptions from the biological sciences substrand of the science understanding strand from the science curriculum. Now, if you were to see version 8.4, which is in the PowerPoint slide still, if you've downloaded the PowerPoint slide, you'll see that the only difference between that version and this version is in year 9, where we are now have explicitly put in there the reproductive system. Okay, so human reproductive system, to make sure that that's done before they hit year 10 and senior. But pretty much everything else is the same. Okay, excellent. So let's get right onto it. Now, one of the most important but underrated ideas within science is taxonomy, which is pretty much just putting things into groups. Okay, and as humans, we do this naturally anyway, in that we automatically will try and group ideas, group things, put things in order to help us understand the universe. Okay, so once upon a time, all the way back in Aristotle's time, their classification system was living things, were either plants, animals. Okay, and so you might have played that old-timey game of animal, plant, or vegetable, and it was a guessing game where you had to ask questions, you got yes or no answers, and that you try to arrive at whether the mystery object was an animal, plant, or vegetable. Now, when we have a look at living things, now animals and plants, that makes sense, right? However, when you have a look at the categories for plants, they were classified as small, medium, large, and in animals, they had land, water, and land, water, and air. So there are obvious deficiencies in that classification system because it's clumping together a whole bunch of animals and just living things which are unrelated when you look into it a little bit further. Okay, so that's kind of where we started. Now, this table represents our understanding of what we would consider more scientific approaches to classification. So you can see there, Linnaeus, he's the one is credited for kicking all of this off. So before then, there was that Aristotelian kind of conception of putting living things into those two main groups. And so Linnaeus kind of followed along in that tradition of what we have are animals and plants. Okay? He didn't do the small, medium, and large, and land, water, and air kind of distinction, but he used observable characteristics of those plants and animals. So with flowering plants, he obviously relied on the flowers, on their reproductive structures, but when it came to animals, there was a whole range of other features which were included. With the advent of the invention of the microscope, we could all of a sudden see this life, this microscopic life for the first time. And so that's how we had the birth of the Pratistan kingdom. Okay? And so then there were three kingdoms. Do a little bit more science, develop much better microscopes, and all of a sudden we understand that when we look at plants and animals, all the way down at the cellular level, we realize that there's only real two distinctions at that much large level. Now what we've got are prokaryotes or prokaryota and eukaryota. And that's referring to whether there is a distinct nucleus within those, an enclosed nucleus within those particular two cell types. Okay? So you've got the bacterians and protistans and a bunch of other stuff which belong in prokaryota, and then we've got eukaryota. So that the karyota part refers to nucleus. So prokaryota before the nucleus, and then eukaryota, these are the cellular life forms which have a nucleus. Fast forward again, when they had a look at those nucleated cellular life forms, they realize, oh, there are differences between the plant, animal, and protistine cells, and so let's put them into different categories. Come 1969, do a little bit more investigating, realize, oh, actually, you know what? Fungi are not like plants at all. They are their own thing. So let's go ahead and put them into their own kingdom. Come forward again. We had Monera, so they're the bacteria. And then we realize, oh, actually, there's the eubacteria, the new bacteria, and then archaebacteria, the old bacteria. So they got split. Dig deeper again, and all of a sudden realize, actually, you know what, this kingdoms doesn't work because there are actually key differences in the cell membranes between bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So therefore, let's create a higher level, and this highest level is domain. So you may have learned king, field, class, ordinary, families, genera, special. However, we need to add a D to the front of that. Okay, and the most common mnemonic which has been developed is dumb, king, field, blah, 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 to take into account that we now include domain. Now, then we've got the Cavalier-Smith, the two versions of the Cavalier-Smith. They've kind of not really taken off, probably more so in the hardcore academic fields, and particularly in fields which deal specifically with, say, for example, the protistins and archozoa and protozoans. Yeah, so for us within junior secondary, we generally stick to either the 6 kingdom or even the 5 kingdom classification system, and we might introduce them to the domains, but definitely doing domains by the time they get to 11 and 12. So let's talk about the Linnaean classification system. So this is the one that we use today, and over on the left there, you see how we've got living things, then living things being broken down into those 3 domains, those domains being broken down to kingdom, phyla, class, order, all the way down to species. This is what we call a nested system. So species, groups of species are nested within genera. Groups of genera are clumped into families, and order, class, all the way up to the largest category of phenomena that we look at is life. So that's kind of in the name of the field that we study, biology, the study of life. Okay, and this is the way that we try and make sense of all of the diversity of life out there by using this nested classification system. And this triangle kind of gives you an example. I think it's us. Yes, that's us. And takes us all the way down from the domain that we're in all the way down to our species there. Okay? And that's what Linnaeus looked like. So here are some other representations. So these won't be examined, but what's important is that you get a sense of just the richness and diversity of life and the different ways that we can show that. Okay, so there's a fairly typical tree, there's an actual tree. Here's a circular representation, and then you've got that zoom in window just to show how many leaves there are on this tree, and also to be space efficient by putting in a circle. But probably my favorite representation is this one here. Okay, so starting in the middle of the diagram is time 0 from when Earth was born, and then moving out either way and away from that center is represents time. Okay, so you can see here the black. So the very first life forms that we encountered that arose here on Earth were the bacteria. Contrary to popular belief and what the name says, the archaeans, the ancient ones, well, not as ancient as bacteria, but they were more ancient than what appeared after them, the eukaryotes. So if you kind of follow the diagram around and over this way, you kind of get that progression of how life appeared as it rolled out, as evolved on Earth. You can also see the prominence of various animal groups over time, and then their disappearance over time. And so most modern time today is kind of like this very outside ring. You can see just how much life there is. You can see extinction events where you've got these gaps, and then all of a sudden the branches of the tree around it, kind of coming in and filling those ecological niches. Sorry, not ecological niches, that species space. And what else? Oh, and we're all the way up here, yeah? So it's not so much that we are the pinnacle of some kind of pyramid, that we are just a leaf within a much larger system, okay? So let's have a look at kingdom Animalia in a little bit more detail, because biology may not be your area, and more than likely there's going to be a concept that you have to teach. Now, this is a fairly simple kind of primary representation of how animals are classified, and yes, you can roughly classify it in terms of vertebrates and invertebrates, okay? Now, this is kind of okay for year 9, year 10, but year 10, especially if they're intending to go on to do senior biology, they need to be thinking this way, yeah? So not so much that we've got invertebrates and invertebrates, the backbones and no backbones, yeah? The splitting occurs much higher up, and how we get the phyla is not so much backbone, no backbone, but a different classification system, classifying idea that you'll learn about in senior biology. And then you've got subphyla, and then you've got classes, okay? So it's fairly important for you to have an understanding at this level, so that when you're teaching students at this level, you're not introducing misconceptions that just have to be undone later on. What's more important for generally for students is that they can look at this diagram and understand how the groupings were made, okay? So why is fish and how is fish, the fishes, different to the amphibians, is different to the birds, is different to the mammals, and so forth, okay? That's probably what's more important, an idea of using observable characteristics to place animals into groups, and then use that idea of nested groups to create the lower and lower, more specific categories of the system, okay? So the links to these videos, I highly recommend that you watch them, especially if you need to bring yourself up to speed in this area. So you can pause, go and watch these, and come back. The links are in the description below. Let's have a talk about food webs, okay? So another major idea that you are most likely, highly likely to teach is that of food webs, okay? Now, a food web is a web that shows the feeding relationships within an ecosystem. Another way to think about it is the flow of energy within an ecosystem. So depending upon how far your school takes it, will depend upon where you introduce that idea of energy flow through a system, or whether you just look at it as this thing is eaten by this other thing, okay? So when we have a look at a food web like this, generally what we have is, the order is that we've got the producers down the bottom. They tend to be plants down the bottom, and they form the base of the food web. Then the level above that are animals which eat plants, or those producers. Generally they're herbivores. So you can see here, whole bunch of herbivorous animals, okay? Now sometimes you've got some omnivorous animals which will eat plants and animals, but none are represented within this food web, okay? So then we've got the first level of producers, consumers, okay? So we can refer to them as either herbivores or first level consumers. If you're an animal which eats a first order consumer, then you're a second order consumer, and you go all the way up to the top. So when you hear of things being referred to being on top of the food web or top of an ecosystem, then this is what we're talking about here. It's the animal at the tops of these diagrams. So within this ecosystem, we've got foxes, hawks, owls, and snakes at the top of those food systems, okay? Now, what's super, super interesting is that when you look at these, like, big deal, who cares about food webs? However, they are diagrams which can help you explore what is the impact of adding or removing a species from a food web. Now, if you're online, you're going to explore this particular idea using an online simulation, okay? So you'll get to have fun with that. Okay. So what I mean by by exploring the impact, we can think of this web as a spider's web. Okay. So each of the animals and each of the plants, they represent a node within that spider's web, and you can if you can imagine a spider's web in front of you, and it's kind of pulled tight, and all the threads are nice and taut. If you ping one of those spider's webs, that will ripple out throughout the web, and the same thing here. Okay, so if you ping one of these relationships, either get rid of it or kind of ramp up one of them, then that is going to ripple out and have effects throughout the food web. Okay? So for example, if we remove foxes from the food web, can you see how you could make a prediction that, oh, we're going to have more rabbits, yeah, more rabbits, more squirrels, more mice, more seed-eating birds. Okay? So as their numbers go up, the number of plants that they feed on is going to go down. Yeah? And as their numbers go up, then hawks and owl numbers will go up, because there's no longer the cap of the foxes taking that portion of the available food, so that those animals, the energy that those first order consumers have taken from the producers, will then flow on up to the hawks and owls, and so forth. Okay? So not only will there be effects which go up and down the food web, but the effects will ripple out even laterally. So the fact that these guys are eating more and more plants, that potentially can reduce herbivorous insect numbers, because then there'll be less food for them. Okay? So you can see how super important it is to maintain the biodiversity of food webs, because things are so interconnected that yes, there is some capacity to absorb some of these pings and some of these removals of some of these species, but if there are keystone species that you remove, the results can be disastrous. Okay? So keystone species is the focus of this video here. So pause, watch the video, and have a go at doing this activity, drawing a flow diagram of what was the impact of reintroducing that keystone species. Okay? Here's another extra idea, that what we looked at earlier, these things are the green food web, yeah? Because the producers down the bottom, they are photosynthetic plants, living photosynthetic organisms, which feed the green web. There's also an equally important brown web that exists out there, and is probably more important in some ecosystems. Go ahead and watch that, super fascinating. Okay? Now, I just want to talk very quickly about nitrogen cycles, because this is a nice way of bringing in indigenous science. Okay? So, what the hell does nitrogen cycles have to do with anything? Okay? Well, First Nations people around the world, there's Brewarrina, which is down in New South Wales. Here's Canadian First Peoples. There's South American First Peoples. This is South Asia. All throughout the world, there have been instances where humans have worked with nature in understanding the role of how animals fit into the nitrogen cycle. So Brewarrina fish trap. Yeah? These fish, they go out into the ocean, they do their fish things, and they come all the way back upstream to Australian rivers to spawn and lay their babies, and before they go off and die. Okay? Indigenous Australians understood this, so they watched and monitored the system, and then they created an environment at Brewarrina, and also there's another one down in Victoria, which I cannot remember its name, but what they did was they manipulated the physical environment to make it ideal breeding grounds, ideal existing grounds for the fish. So then the fish became overpopulated, they were to skim the top and then feed the people and not damage the existing nitrogen cycle. Yeah. Up here in Canada, they did the same thing. So the running of the salmon, that was a well-known phenomenon to First Nations Canadians, and they understood the relationship between the fish, the salmon, and the health of the forest. Because what would happen is the salmon, just like the burrow in a fish trap, the fish would bring nitrogen in the form of their muscles and their bodies, go up into the streams, do their fish things, die, but then feed bears and flies and a whole range of other stuff. And so they would fertilize those great big forests of Canada. And also the same thing would have been going on here in Australia. Chinampas over in South America, essentially floating gardens. So you had fish and you had human waste kind of floating around in this water. All they would do was scoop it out of the canals onto these floating gardens. And so what they would do is then complete that nitrogen cycle. Very, very similar thing happening over here in Southeast Asia. So it's super, super important that we understand how these natural cycles worked and acknowledge that that understanding has been with us for thousands of years and we just need to rediscover it. No? Okay, so here's another example, just a little bit more about that salmon and eel migration and how they build forests, and here are some videos on that if you are interested. Okay, let's talk about cells. So, cells, yeah. One of the key things that you'll need to be able to do for the exam is describe the tenets of the cell theory. Okay, so here they are. I'm not going to read them for you, but what I want you to do is to watch this video and see if you can extract the same information. Okay, so those are the three precepts, important ideas of the cell theory. Okay, and so the cell theory is a theory that, as point number one suggests, is that all life is made up of cells. Then along came viruses and kind of threw a whole spanner in the works. And so we've had to expand our definition slightly. But even though viruses exist, it doesn't completely demolish the whole cell theory. It just weakens it. And what we will need to do is somehow reconcile the fact that viruses actually even exist and how we're going to fit that into a more accurate understanding, ontology of the nature of life. Okay, excellent. Okay. So go ahead and watch that video. Cell theory done. Human organ systems. Now, in year 9, in the old version, we used to do all of the body systems. You would have seen early in that earlier slide, we now just focus on the human reproductive system. So, to explain that in terms of the levels of biological organization, what we've got up here, can I see cursor? Oh yeah, cool. Okay, so we've got up here atoms, and atoms form molecules, and molecules form blah, 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 blah. So here we've got a phospholipid, and so then you've got a bunch of those, and they make cells. Okay, you get a bunch of cells together, they make tissues, get a bunch of tissues together, they make lungs. Now, the level that you're looking at when it comes to organ biology is this one here, okay? So we're looking at systems within the body which are composed of a bunch of different organs, which are composed of a bunch of different issues, okay? And so, blah, 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 blah. So there are a whole bunch of systems within the body. Now, animals have their own systems. They're kind of related and sometimes unrelated. You'll deal more with those in senior biology, but for junior secondary science, we just stick to the human organ systems because they're the most familiar. Okay? Now, I'm going to leave this PowerPoint within the Teams site, and what I'd like you to do is to get together with groups of students, okay, and divvy up the human systems. So there's a human digestive system, cardiorespiratory, reproductive, and female reproductive. Okay, so get together a bunch of students, divvy up these, and what I want you to do is to complete this thinking tool. Okay, so tell me what the organ is. What is the name of the structure of the organ? Describe it. Where is it in the system? How big is it? What is it made of? And then what does it do? So an overriding thing that we do in biology is that we describe the structure and function of stuff. Okay? So we do that with cells, and we do that with organs, we do that with organisms, whole range of stuff. So structure and function is going to be the key idea that we're after here when it comes to the body systems. Now, eventually, when you're teaching this unit, you'll move beyond this kind of understanding of structure and function and then look at how things are related. Okay? Because then that leads to the next branch of science, which is physiology. Okay? Now, within physiology, there's this important idea of homeostasis. And homeo, the same, stasis, the state. Yeah? So homeostasis is the body's desire to maintain an even state. So if it gets disturbed, it goes a little bit higher, then things will kick in to bring it a bit lower. If it gets too low, other systems will kick in to bring it back up to that even level. So there's a range of within which we operate, and we want to stay within that range, and we have systems within our body to make sure that we don't move outside, because outside of that range is too dangerous. Let's look at an example to hopefully solidify that idea. So let's look at, say, temperature. Yeah. So if you think that you're out on a hot day, you're out in the sun, one of the so you being out in the sun hitting the skin, your skin says, hey, it's getting hot. There are sensors in your skin, temperature sensors in your skin, which can detect the temperature. They send signals to the brain. The temperature, another way that we can detect heat is by the temperature of the blood. There are temperature sensors at the bottom of the carotid artery here. There's barosensors and temperature sensors that detect the blood temperature, and they too can send signals to the brain to say, hey, we need to cool down. So then that triggers either behaviors for you to find shade, or you start to breathe heavier, or you can start to sweat. So there is a signal from the external part of the body, gets sent to the control center of the brain. The control center makes a decision to act and then sends out signals to other parts of the body to either upregulate or to deregulate whatever it's trying to control. Okay? So sensors was the temperature sensors in the skin, temperature sensor in the carotid. They send signals to the control. The control says, well, we are getting too hot. They send signals to other parts of the body to do something. So if we're too hot, then we might sweat. If we're too cold, then we will have vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. We'll get blood being drawn away from the extremities, particularly the fingers and toes. You might even start to shiver as another response to the cold. So what we have here are negative feedback loops to keep you within that nice tight middle range, within normal operating parameters, for want of a better word. Okay? Excellent. So let's move on to the last topic, which is Mendelian genetics. Okay? So Mendelian genetics. So as the name, this is the guy who came up with this. So he played around with peas, and he just happened to stumble on an organism which, when you looked at certain characteristics, they tended to have two forms and two forms only. So when you have a look at seeds, they could be round and grey, or they could be white and wrinkled. The cotyledons, the seed leaf, they can either be yellow or they can be green. The flowers can be white or violet, and you can see the range of other characteristics. Now, it was super, super lucky that he landed on peas. Now, it isn't strictly dominant recessive like it's trying to make out here. There's a little bit more complexity, but on the whole, it was dichotomous in terms of you're either yellow pod or green pod, full pod or constricted pod. Yeah, and that made Mendel much more successful than anybody else who looked at, say, humans or cats or dogs, where there are far fewer of these kind of dominant recessive kind of characteristics for you to explore. Okay, and also it's harder to breed animals and humans as well. So plants are nice and easy. Okay. So what he did was he did experiments, and he came up with these 3 laws of genetics. Okay? Now the first one is that of dominance. So within a particular characteristic, pod color, pod form, whatever it is, there is a recessive trait and a dominant trait. When you've got the presence of the dominant trait, it will always be expressed. Okay? So if the genotype, within the genotype, if there's a dominant gene, it will always be expressed in the phenotype, regardless of whether it is with a recessive gene. The only time you get expression of a recessive gene is if there are 2 copies. Okay? So here you can see the genetics of one parent being homozygous for tall plants, and then you've got being crossed with another parent who's short. So the only way that you can be a short P is if you inherit a short gene copy from dad and a short gene copy from mum, so that in you've got the 2 recessive genes together. Okay? Another idea that Mendel came up with is that of segregation. Okay? So from the parent, whatever characteristics the parent had, that got split up. Okay? So he formulated that for every characteristic you have 2 copies, what we now call alleles, of the instructions for that characteristic, and that when breeding occurs to create the next generation, those 2 versions of the genes get separated. And so that's how he explained when you had 2 individuals which were heterozygous, yeah, so big T, little t, big T, little t, the only way that you can describe and predict that pattern of inheritance, where then you got 75 tall pea plants, 75 short pea plants, is if we've got 2 copies of each allele and that they independently sort into the next category, which is the next rule. Okay? So that segregation is the splitting, and independent assortment is that they can be assorted in any different arrangement. Yeah. So if you look at if you look at, say, a dihybrid cross, where you're looking at the color of the, what's that one? The P form and the P color, then there you introduce more complexities, more combinations of those different allele types. Okay, so here's a whole bunch of examples. Now, caveat: don't tell kids that eye color is dominant recessive in humans. It is not at all. So just make up an animal where this is the case, and you have a go at completing these crosses. So these are Punnett squares. These are how we look at the genetics of a parent to determine the genetics of the offspring, and therefore predict the proportion of the phenotypes within that offspring generation. So have a go at those. We won't go through those now. I won't bore you to death. But as we click on, here are the answers. Cool. And let's have a look at the last topic, the actual last topic now. That is evolution by natural selection. Okay? So when we have a look out to the world, one of the big questions that we ask is, how did we get here? Yeah? And so when you have a look at in Australian Indigenous cultures, they say there were these creative dreamtime spirits. So for example, here in the Gold Coast, one of those spirits is Jabreen. And when he died, he formed the Burleigh Headlands. And then his club fell down and formed Little Burleigh Hill. So different cultures use different ideas to explain how we get the variety of life that's around us. Yeah? And then science, because of our empiricism, we want to have evidence of this. Okay? So stories are great, yeah. However, what we want is evidence to explain how we came up with this diversity of life that we can see here. Now, Darwin was a very, very keen observer. When back in England, when he was kicking around, he looked around and saw that there were people who bred different types of animals. So there were dog breeders, there were cat breeders, there were cattle breeders, there were bird breeders, bird fanciers. And so he observed that in this particular instance, what we were doing as humans was we were selecting the individuals, the parents, that were going to breed with the desirable characteristics that we wanted. So, faster running dog for hunting, big scary dog for protection, birds that produced eggs every day, yeah? Cattle that produced milk every day. So what we had done is we had acted like nature to select individuals within those species, breed them together to make those characteristics more populous, much more widespread in the next generation. So he saw that we harnessed the existing variety within all of these animals. We harnessed those existing varieties to produce new varieties or to extend those varieties, make them bigger or smaller. Yeah? So not only did we do that for humans, we did that for plants. So here, the brassica plant. Okay? So anyone who thinks that broccoli is natural, no, broccoli is not natural. Broccoli is a man-made product. Yeah? So is cabbage, so is cauliflower, so is kale. All of those are man-made because we took the wild mustard plant, that thing there in the middle, and what we did is we selected for certain characteristics, either larger leaves, to sprout or not to sprout, or whatever it was, whatever type of broccoli thing that we needed, then we would select individuals and ramp and amplify those. Here's a bunch of other plants that we've modified over time. The ancestor, and then the modern equivalent. Banana, modern Cavendish. Eggplant, modern eggplant, yeah? Carrot, and so forth. And so what we've done, oh, this is the best one down here, done by the South Americans, going from teosinte to maize. Phenomenal engineering. So what we've done is we've become the selective pressure for, in terms of human desire and need, more milk, more eggs, more tasty yellow fruit, for example. We've applied that, so we have shaped nature. Okay? So then Darwin thought, I wonder what's doing that out in the wild. How is it that lions are getting faster and gazelle are getting faster? What's the selection pressure here? And through developing his ideas, he came up with 3 laws. 4 laws, 3 laws. Let's see. Yeah? So, for evolution to occur, there must be variation. And if you look around the room, if you look around the cohort, if you're in the library, humans, we are wildly different. Okay? And so for evolution to occur, for new species to occur, we need to have these initial starting differences. Some of us are taller, some of us are shorter, some of us are wider, and so forth. Yeah? We need that variation. There must be competition in terms of not everybody reproduces. Okay? So in this game of evolution, it's about producing offspring. So whoever produces the most offspring wins evolution. Okay? There must be a mechanism of how the characteristics, information of the characteristics, are passed from parents to offspring. So once upon a time, we thought that was blood, which is why we use blood a lot of times when we're describing heritability in humans. So our bloodline, so all of those kind of terms are related to that old thinking that it was the blood, which is how information got passed from parent to offspring. Okay? And so with all the combination of all three of these characteristics, yeah, so we all vary in some way, and that we're all competing for resources or mates and to produce the most offspring, and that there must be some way of the information that's within my body makes it into the next body. Okay? And so the whole point of this is that there are individuals who are able to outcompete or out-reproduce others. Okay. Excellent. And as they do so, they become more common in the population, as we said earlier. So there's a whole range of pieces of evidence from disparate, different fields which support the theory of evolution. So we've got some ecology, and we've got some bird anatomy, there's some more anatomy, here's some genetics, and here's the fossil record, and here's the fossil record again. What's important to note here is that wildly different fields, anatomy, physiology, chemistry, biology, they all converge on the idea that evolution by natural selection is probably the right idea and the right way to go. Okay? Excellent. Here are some memes for you to look at, pause and enjoy at your own leisure. And I just want to come back to this, because while physicists are still chasing their grand unifying theory of everything to combine all of their ideas, we're done in biology, because our idea, our key idea, grand unifying theory, is that of evolution. And I love that quote. Yeah? So here's some more videos, the links are in the description, or you can open up the PowerPoint and access them that way. And this is what we covered today. Excellent. Thank you very much.